You walk through the smoking ruins of Berlin in the summer of 1945, your shoes crunching over broken glass and twisted steel, as if the entire city had been ground down into ash and rubble by some angry hand. The air smells of damp stone and smouldering wood, a kind of sour odor that lingers after bombs have done their work. Here and there, walls lean precariously, their windows blasted out like hollow eyes, and you half expect them to topple just because you look too long. Yet against this backdrop of devastation, the red flags of the Soviet Union flap alongside the stars and stripes and Union Jacks, claiming not only military victory, but ownership of Germany's future. It is a strange sight, foreign soldiers directing traffic on Unter den Linden tanks, idling where opera houses once rang with arias, and weary Berliners queuing for scraps of bread, as though queues were the only order left in the universe. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world like a family, scattered but still connected. The war had not just defeated Germany, it had cracked the country open like a porcelain vase dropped onto concrete. At the Potsdam conference that summer, you find yourself almost hovering in the back of the room as the leaders of the victorious Allies, Stalin, Truman and Attlee, sit at a massive round table, maps spread before them like a game board. They argue over boundaries, reparations and the soul of the country itself. Germany is too big, too dangerous, they mutter, to ever be allowed to rise again, unchecked. And so the four occupying powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, slice the nation into zones of control, an arrangement that looks temporary on paper, but already feels like a long winter settling in. Berlin, ironically located in the Soviet sector, is also cut into four, a kind of geopolitical joke: one city, four masters, no real sovereignty. You hear the pens scratching on documents, signing away futures, as if sovereignty could be divvied up like pie at a dinner table. Historians still argue whether Stalin ever seriously intended to cooperate with the West in governing Germany, or whether he already saw the division as inevitable. But for the people trudging through rubble, the debates of statesmen mean little compared to the simple need for potatoes, coal and roofs that don't leak. The daily reality is bleak. You imagine yourself scavenging wood from collapsed buildings just to keep warm through the coming winter. The currency has collapsed. Cigarettes, chocolate, and even American chewing gum function better than money. The black market is the only market that really works. And yet, amid the dust and desperation, life insists on continuing. Children play in the ruins, women patch together bricks for makeshift homes, and Allied soldiers sometimes hand out food or chocolate bars, gestures that feel both generous and humiliating. A quirky detail: one of the most desired items in those months was actually nylon stockings, which American GIs sometimes distributed to local women. For people who had spent years in grey uniforms and threadbare clothes, the luxury of a pair of sheer stockings was almost revolutionary. In its own way, nylon became as much a symbol of the West's abundance as jazz records or Coca-Cola. But the darker undercurrent is impossible to ignore. In the Soviet zone, you noticed the methodical dismantling of factories and railways, whole industries packed up and shipped eastward as reparations. The Red Army presence is heavy, and their behavior varies from harsh discipline to outright predation. In the Western zones, meanwhile, there's a growing determination to rebuild Germany as a bulwark against communism. Already the ideological split begins to seep into the bricks and mortar. What one side strips away, the other side plans to restore. Berlin itself becomes the theatre where this global tug-of-war plays out. On the one hand, cabaret singers try to resurrect old tunes in dimly lit bars, their voices echoing through half-ruined halls. On the other hand, meetings of newly forming political parties reveal deep mistrust. Communists, Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, everyone is jostling for a voice in shaping the new Germany. But behind them stand their occupying patrons whispering instructions. You can almost hear the stage directions: Moscow pushing one way, Washington another, London frowning in fatigue, Paris insisting on a voice despite being late to the table. One mainstream historical fact to anchor yourself. The Nuremberg trials begin in late 1945 as top Nazi leaders are brought before an international court for crimes against humanity. You imagine the flicker of cameras as evidence of death camps is projected on screens, forcing the German public to confront horrors they might have whispered about but never dared admit. The trials serve as both moral reckoning and political theatre, hammering home that the old Germany is not simply defeated, it is delegitimized. As you drift between the crumbled streets and grand halls of Allied conferences, the sense grows that Germany is no longer the master of its own destiny. Instead, it is the object lesson of the world, a pawn in the larger chess game already forming between East and West. The seeds of division are planted in this soil of ruin, watered by distrust and fertilized by ideology. There's an eerie moment when you pass Brandenburg Gate, still standing though scarred, where Soviet and American soldiers both snap photographs, each claiming the image as proof of victory. The gate, once a proud symbol of Prussian kings, now stands like a weary witness to the fact that victory has fractured into occupation, and the people moving beneath it carrying bundles of firewood or leading hungry children by the hand walk as though in someone else's dream. If you linger in this broken Berlin long enough, you feel it. The future is already pulling in two directions. One side promises socialist reconstruction, land reform, equality on paper, and an iron grip in practice. The other side whispers about democracy, consumer goods, and re-entry into the family of nations, but also about dependency on foreign aid. For now, Berliners just huddle against the cold and wonder which promise will feed them fastest. And so as the year closes, Germany stands at a threshold it did not choose. Ruins lie underfoot, Allied zones dictate life, and a question hangs in the smoke-filled air. Can a nation so thoroughly broken ever stitch itself together again? You walk on past the cracked stones and hollow-eyed facades, not knowing that the answer will take 45 years to unfold. You step out of the rubble-strewn ruins of 1945 Berlin and into the late 1940s and 1950s, where the shattered map of Germany has hardened into two diverging worlds. At first glance, the difference feels like a line in the sand, but when you look closer, it's a trench filling with ideology, mistrust, and very practical contrasts of daily life. In the Soviet zone, factories are nationalized, land is redistributed to peasants, and political opposition is quietly but firmly pushed aside until one party, the Socialist Unity Party, the SED, dominates everything. Meanwhile, in the Western zones, the Marshall Plan pours in money, new institutions are built, and even the taste of consumer capitalism begins to waft through the air in the form of chewing gum jazz clubs and eventually shiny Volkswagen Beetles. If you lived in Dresden in the East, you'd wake to ration cards shortages and endless meetings about socialist productivity. If you lived in Düsseldorf in the West, you'd start seeing new roads, new housing, and markets filled with goods that were once unimaginable luxuries. Families once close-knit across regions now discover themselves scattered along an invisible divide that grows heavier every year. A grandmother might be in Leipzig, her son in Frankfurt, her granddaughter in Bonn, and the letters between them carry not just affection, but layers of censorship, suspicion, and delay. The capital itself becomes a caricature of this split. In West Berlin, neon lights flicker back on American GIs dance in jazz clubs, and the smell of coffee wafts from kitchens as prosperity trickles in. In East Berlin, giant portraits of Stalin stare down from buildings, workers march in orchestrated parades, and a pervasive sense of surveillance takes root even before the full terror of the Stasi has arrived. You can almost hear the different rhythms of the city, swing and rock and roll on one side, martial music, and factory whistles on the other. A quirky tidbit: in the late 1940s, West German children began receiving something called care packages from American families overseas, containing items like chocolate, canned goods, and even powdered milk. For many kids, the first taste of peanut butter came not from local markets, but from strangers across the ocean. Some of those children, now elderly, still remember the sweet shock of Hershey bars as their first glimpse of the wider world. But beneath the small comforts, the tension builds. By 1949, the two zones have formal names: the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, with Bonn as its modest capital, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, headquartered in East Berlin. The irony of those names is almost comedic. Federal and democratic each try to stake a claim to legitimacy, but you sense that the words serve more as branding than truth. Historians still argue whether this formal split was unavoidable, or whether with different leadership and less paranoia, Germany might have remained a single, though neutral state. The Western Allies insist that their Germany will be democratic capitalist and eventually integrated into NATO. The Soviets, meanwhile, sculpt their half into a socialist showcase for the Eastern Bloc. Both sides use propaganda to paint themselves as the real Germany. In the West, posters feature smiling families in new cars. In the East, posters show heroic workers holding hammers aloft, framed against rising smokestacks. Each side insists this is the true future of the German people. And you, standing in the middle of it, feel like the child of divorced parents tugged in two directions by voices promising love but demanding loyalty. Everyday life reflects this pull. If you cross into West Germany in the 1950s, you encounter what becomes known as the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Factories hum, exports surge, wages climb, and suddenly refrigerators and washing machines appear in middle-class homes. West Germans, with support from the Marshall Plan and deft leadership by Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and his economics minister Ludwig Erhard, begin to taste stability, even comfort. Meanwhile, in East Germany, industrial output is also rising, but much of it flows toward the Soviet Union as reparations and consumer goods remain scarce. Instead of new appliances, you see endless lines at state-run shops where sometimes shoes come only in one size or bananas vanish for years at a time. And yet not everything is bleak on the socialist side. There is genuine pride in new housing blocks rising from rubble in free education and healthcare in cultural programs that promise a workers' state that cares for its people. You can hear schoolchildren singing songs about collective achievement, their voices earnest, their eyes hopeful. It's only later that the cracks will show, when dissent is punished, when travel is restricted, when shortages drag down spirits. But for now, in the 1950s, the divide is just beginning to harden into something permanent. You feel it most in the whispers of people who risk crossing the sectors. By the late 1950s, nearly 3 million East Germans have fled westward, many through Berlin, where the border remains relatively porous. Doctors, engineers, and teachers slip away, draining the East of talent and fueling West German prosperity. Families are torn apart, not by war this time, but by the silent decision to cross from one future into another. The East German state grows increasingly nervous. If this continues, they fear they will have no citizens left to govern. Walking the streets of Berlin in 1955, you sense that tension. A cafe on one corner is full of chatter about America's new rock and roll stars, while across the sector border, a meeting hall blares out speeches on socialist unity. At night, the city's lights are uneven neon billboards glowing in the west, dim bulbs flickering in the east. It is one city, but already two different worlds, one selling choice, the other selling equality, both claiming to be the better parent. And in that tug-of-war, ordinary people continue to live split lives, siblings writing cautious letters across the border, lovers whispering about escaped parents, wondering which side of Germany will shape their children's future. What was once rubble has now been rebuilt into two opposing visions, and though the scars of war are fading, a new scar is opening, the one that cuts through the German soul itself. The hum begins as a low vibration in the night sky, distant at first, then louder, until the drone of engines becomes as constant as your own heartbeat. You tilt your head back and see them, Allied planes, swooping in a steady procession, each glowing faintly under the moonlight as they descend toward Tempelhof and Gatow airfields. It is 1948 and you are in West Berlin, an island of defiance, floating in a sea of Soviet control. Food is scarce, coal is running out, and suddenly the city is under siege, not by bombs this time, but by a blockade. Stalin has cut off all railroad and canal routes into West Berlin, hoping to squeeze the Allies into surrender and force the city entirely into Soviet hands. You shuffle into a line at a ration station, clutching your tin bowl, the air thick with the scent of boiled potatoes and desperation. Everyone murmurs the same question, will the planes keep coming? And they do. Day after day, night after night, American and British pilots fly round the clock, dropping flour, milk, coal and medical supplies into a city of 2 million. The effort becomes known as the Berlin airlift, and if you close your eyes, you can almost feel the vibrations of hope as those aircraft rumble overhead. Children especially watch the skies. Some of the pilots begin dropping small candy parcels attached to handkerchief parachutes, earning themselves the nickname candy bombers. Imagine being a child who hasn't seen chocolate in years, suddenly catching a sweet as it flutters from the clouds. It must have felt like Willy Wonka had joined the war effort. One quirky anecdote: an American pilot named Gail Halverson started the tradition by tying candy to little parachutes after noticing kids gathered by the fence at Tempelhof. His kindness sparked a movement, and soon American confectionery companies donated tons of candy to keep the raisin bombers going. The scale of the operation boggles the mind. At the height of the airlift, planes were landing every 90 seconds, delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily. You imagine the thunder of their wheels hitting the runway, the gust of propellers whipping dust into the faces of weary Berliners, the sudden relief of unloading sacks of flour that mean one more day of survival. Inside the warehouses, women and men bag potatoes, divide coal, and distribute milk with military precision, as if each calorie is a bullet in the new war for hearts and minds. On the Soviet side, the blockade seems both clever and cruel. Stalin calculates that the Western Allies won't risk open conflict, and that Berlin will fall quietly into Soviet control. But the gamble backfires. Instead of retreating, the Allies dig in. The airlift becomes not just a logistical miracle, but a symbol proof that the West will not abandon its outpost, proof that freedom, however rationed, will be defended. Historians still argue whether Stalin ever considered shooting down the planes, or whether he recognized that such an act would ignite a third world war. For the citizens below, the uncertainty is constant. Every roar of engines carries not only food, but also the possibility of a sudden spark that could consume the globe again. Everyday life during the blockade is a mix of resilience and fatigue. You sit by a dim lamp powered by dwindling coal supplies, listening to the crackle of radio broadcasts that urge endurance. Neighbors share whatever they can spare. Children draw planes on scraps of paper, turning survival into play. And despite the hunger and the cold, there is pride in endurance. To live through this blockade is to send a message: we will not be starved into submission. By May 1949, the Soviets finally lift the blockade, acknowledging its failure. The city erupts in a cautious sort of celebration, though rationing continues and wounds remain deep. But the psychological impact is immense. West Berliners feel bound to the Western Allies by a bond of gratitude, forged not on paper, but in hunger, air, and hope. The Western powers in turn recognize that they cannot abandon Berlin no matter the cost. One mainstream historical fact that cements this moment: the Berlin airlift delivered over 2 million tons of supplies during its duration, a feat of logistics that remains one of the most impressive peacetime operations in history. To this day, Berlin has memorials shaped like soaring arcs of airplanes, reminding everyone that survival once came from the clouds. The quirky, almost tender image of children chasing candy parachutes hides a darker reality. The blockade also seals the division of Germany. Within months of its end, West Germany formally declares itself the Federal Republic, while the Soviets respond by establishing the German Democratic Republic in the east. The airlift saved a city but split a nation. You walk again through the streets of Berlin, this time noticing how quickly the scars are being papered over with slogans. In the West, posters of democracy and free elections plaster the walls. In the East, banners of Marx and Lenin announce a new dawn. But the airlift has made something clear. Berlin is no longer just a city. It is the front line of the Cold War, a prize neither side will give up, a symbol that feeds propaganda as much as it feeds people. And so when you hear that hum in the distance again, the endless procession of engines, you realize it is more than noise. It is the soundtrack of division, the rhythm of two worlds moving further apart, even as they both claim to protect the same city. The blockade has ended, yes, but the wall between East and West Germany has already begun to rise, not yet of concrete and barbed wire, but of policy, suspicion, and ideology. It begins almost imperceptibly with a coil of barbed wire unspooled in the dead of night. You can picture it clearly, soldiers moving quietly through the streets of Berlin in the early hours of August 13, 1961, hammering posts into the ground, stringing metal wire across sidewalks and blocking roads that only yesterday were open. By morning, an invisible boundary has hardened into something visible and menacing. You stand at Bernauer Straße, where families live in apartment buildings that straddle the sector border. On one side, windows open onto the west, on the other, stairwells lead only to the east. People awaken to find themselves walled in their relatives, suddenly trapped across an arbitrary line. At first, Berliners can hardly believe it. They rush to the fences, peering over barbed wire, shouting across at neighbors and loved ones. Some even jump from upper floor windows into blankets held by West Berliners below, desperate to escape before the barrier grows taller. Others dig tunnels beneath, slipping through like moles under the city's skin. The atmosphere is part surreal theater, part heartbreak. You can feel the collective gasp of a city split in half overnight. Soon, though, the improvisation solidifies, the wire becomes concrete. Guard towers rise like skeletal sentinels, their searchlights sweeping across the death strip. Armed soldiers patrol with orders to shoot anyone who tries to flee. The so-called anti-fascist protection rampart, as East German officials call it with Orwellian flair, is justified as a defense against Western spies and saboteurs. But everyone knows the truth: the wall is not to keep invaders out, but to keep East Germans in. By then, nearly 20% of the GDR's population has fled westward, draining the socialist state of young talent and hope. The wall is the government's desperate tourniquet, stopping the hemorrhage of its own people. Historians still argue whether Khrushchev, the Soviet leader at the time, pressured East German leader Walter Ulbricht into building the wall, or whether Ulbricht himself begged for permission to do it. What is certain is that Ulbricht famously lied just weeks earlier, assuring reporters that no one has any intention of building a wall. The ink was barely dry on that statement when barbed wire began encircling Berlin. Daily life changes instantly. If you live in East Berlin, you find your morning commute to West Berlin abruptly cancelled. Your job, your friends, even your favorite cafe, suddenly unreachable. If you live in the West, you can still see the East, but it feels like peering into an aquarium where people move behind glass, untouchable. Relatives stand at checkpoints waving desperately, permitted only the briefest visits, if at all. Families exchange letters that take weeks to arrive, each page inspected by unseen sensors. Love stories collapse under the weight of geography, and friendships shrink to memories shouted across walls. A quirky, almost absurd detail: when the wall first went up, some East Berliners actually tried to leap over it with homemade contraptions, poles, ladders, even trampolines. Later, daring escapes included hot air balloons sewn from scraps of cloth, stolen armored vehicles, and even a small airplane. The ingenuity of those willing to risk everything became legend, though the risks were lethal. More than 100 East Berliners were killed attempting to cross, most famously Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old, shot and left to bleed to death in the death strip, while horrified West Berliners looked on, unable to help. His death became a symbol of the wall's cruelty. Meanwhile, propaganda flows thick on both sides. In the East, newspapers celebrate the wall as a triumph of socialism, a bulwark against imperialism. Posters show smiling workers building barricades, though in reality most Berliners stand in stunned silence, their faces etched with grief. In the West, speeches thunder about the wall of shame. President Kennedy's 1963 visit cements that view, his voice echoing across the city when he declares, "Ich bin ein Berliner." The crowd roars not because the phrase is grammatically perfect, linguists still chuckle about whether he declared himself a jelly donut, but because it feels like a promise the West will not abandon Berlin. The wall itself evolves over time from a makeshift fence to a sophisticated system of barriers. By the 1970s, it stretches for 155 kilometers, reinforced with concrete slabs, guard towers, anti-vehicle trenches, and even beds of nails. It becomes less a wall and more a scar across the landscape, visible from space. The graffiti-splashed western side contrasts sharply with the sterile grey of the eastern face, where even painting on the wall could land you in prison. And yet as the decades roll on, the wall becomes more than just a physical structure. It becomes a psychological boundary shaping identities. West Berliners develop a kind of island mentality surrounded by East Germany, yet fiercely independent, a laboratory of culture and freedom sustained by subsidies. East Berliners, meanwhile, learn the language of silence, when to lower their voices, how to glance without staring, how to dream without speaking. As you walk along the wall in those first days of its existence, the silence is deafening. The city that once pulsed with shared rhythms is now divided into two heartbeats, each pumping its own blood, each insisting it is the true lifeline of Germany. The barbed wire may be new, but the division it represents has been long in the making. Now, though it has teeth, and standing there staring at a wall that has risen overnight, you sense that this scar will not heal quickly. What began with rubble and aid flights has hardened into concrete and gun towers. The question lingers in your mind: if a wall can appear overnight, how many nights will it take to bring it down? You find yourself walking through East Berlin in the 1960s, and the wall is now no longer a makeshift wound of barbed wire, but a concrete spine running through the city, rigid and unforgiving. On one side, bright graffiti and neon signs flicker across the western skyline, while on your side, grey concrete slabs stretch on and on, patrolled by guards with blank expressions and rifles that hang too heavily on their shoulders. The atmosphere is one of order imposed so tightly that even laughter feels rationed. If you listen closely, you catch the crunch of boots on gravel, the buzz of searchlights sweeping back and forth, and just underneath it, all the silence of things unsaid. Life behind the wall has a rhythm all its own, a rhythm of queues and ration cards, whispered jokes and double-locked doors. In the morning, you step out into streets lined with functional but lifeless apartment blocks, the infamous Plattenbau, where uniformity is the architecture's main achievement. You stand in line for milk or bread at state-run shops, often unsure whether you'll find anything left when it's your turn. Bananas are exotic genes, almost contraband, and Western magazines passed secretly like forbidden treasures. You remember the day you received an orange from a relative in the West, its citrus scent so unfamiliar that you held it for hours before daring to peel it, as though you were holding a relic from another world. The Stasi, the East German secret police, are everywhere, though you rarely see them directly. They live in shadows, in whispers, in the subtle hesitation when a friend pauses before finishing a sentence. They recruit neighbors, co-workers, even family members, turning private life into a minefield. You can never be sure whether your offhand joke about the government will end up in a file folder stacked in some grey office. And yet there is a grim humour in how people cope. A popular quip circulates: the future is certain, it's the past that keeps changing. You chuckle, but softly, because someone might be listening. Historians still argue whether the GDR's citizens truly believed in the socialist project, or whether they merely adapted out of survival. On paper, there are achievements: full employment, generous childcare, free education, and healthcare. You can walk into a clinic without worrying about bills, send your children to university without a penny of tuition. In fact, East German schools produce some of the best trained engineers and scientists in the Eastern Bloc. But at what cost? The textbooks, the newspapers, the lectures, they all echo the same refrain: loyalty to the party, faith in socialism, suspicion of the West. Thought itself becomes rationed, and to think too freely is to risk everything. In the West, the contrast couldn't be starker. You hear rock and roll records drifting over the wall, see the glow of consumer abundance just out of reach. Families visit relatives in West Berlin and return with shopping bags full of marvels, Nescafe nylon stockings, even Lego bricks, objects that become symbols of freedom, as much as toys or groceries. The GDR government tries to compensate with its own products, but they can't keep up. A quirky example, East Germany produces its own brand of Cola Vita, cola marketed as the socialist answer to Coca-Cola. It tastes different, citrusy, herbal, but for many East Germans, that flavor is nostalgia itself, the taste of childhood in a walled country. Daily life isn't all gloom, though. You walk through neighborhoods where children play football in courtyards, old men sip beer at local pubs, and families tend to their garden plots called Schrebergärten, growing tomatoes and potatoes as though cultivating freedom in miniature. Even under surveillance, people find ways to carve out private joys. The theatre, the cabaret, and even state-approved rock bands become subtle arenas for rebellion, slipping double meanings into lyrics that pass under the censor's nose. The people learn resilience not by shouting, but by whispering in ways the state can't quite silence. And yet the pressure builds. In 1965, you hear of a young man trying to swim across the Spree River to freedom, only to be gunned down before reaching the opposite shore. In 1974, you learn of a tunnel dug by students, snaking under the wall to rescue dozens of friends. These stories circulate like folklore, proof that human ingenuity keeps testing the barrier, even at the cost of blood. The wall is supposed to be permanent, but the people remind you that nothing built by human hands can last forever. Meanwhile, West Berlin develops a strange character of its own. Subsidized heavily by West Germany, it becomes a kind of showcase island of freedom and consumerism. Students, artists, and draft dodgers flock there, turning it into a cultural laboratory. You hear jazz in one corner, radical politics in another, and see posters advertising international film festivals as if defiantly declaring, "We are alive despite the wall." The two Berlins now beat at different tempos, but both are defined by the existence of that concrete line. One mainstream historical fact anchors this period from 1961 to 1989. At least 140 people were confirmed killed at or around the Berlin Wall, though some estimates are higher. Each death is a reminder that this barrier is not abstract, not symbolic, but lethal. As you walk along Bernauer Strasse years after the first barbed wire went up, you see the wall now layered with concrete slabs, floodlights, watchtowers, and anti-vehicle trenches. It has become an ecosystem of oppression, a scar that pulses with control. Yet even as soldiers march, children still laugh in courtyards, neighbors still share bread, and musicians still strum guitars. Life behind the wall is not only about fear, it is also about persistence, the quiet determination to live fully in a world that insists on narrowing every possibility. And so you breathe in that paradox, oppression and resilience, silence and laughter, scarcity and stubborn joy. The wall looms above you, cold and grey, but you can almost sense a tremor beneath its foundation, the restless heartbeat of people who one day will demand more than ration cards and slogans. One day, they will demand to live without walls. You drift into the 1970s, and the wall that once felt like an open wound has calcified into the city's anatomy. East and West Berlin continue their separate rhythms, yet a strange new atmosphere hangs in the air, something softer, cautious, almost diplomatic. The word on everyone's lips is Détente, that fashionable Cold War term for relaxation of tension, though in Berlin it feels less like relaxation and more like an awkward handshake held just a beat too long. In West Germany, a new chancellor takes the stage, Willy Brandt. You watch him with his characteristic stoop and thoughtful eyes as he crafts a policy called Ostpolitik, Eastern policy. His idea is deceptively simple. Instead of pretending East Germany doesn't exist, why not talk to it, recognize it, make practical arrangements? After all, families are still split letters, still crawl across borders, and both halves of the country must breathe the same air. Brandt dares to suggest that building bridges, even small rickety ones, might achieve more than shouting across a wall. The symbolism is powerful. In 1970, you see him kneel suddenly in Warsaw at a memorial to victims of the Nazi massacre in the Warsaw Ghetto. He bows deeply, silently, before the stone, and the world holds its breath. No words, no speeches, just the weight of Germany's past pressing down on his shoulders. Some critics scoff, some supporters weep, but for many that gesture becomes one of the most important acts of post-war reconciliation. Historians still argue whether it was a calculated move or a spontaneous act of conscience, but you sense it hardly matters. The image endures because it said more than diplomacy ever could. Germany was trying to reckon with its past in order to build a future. Ostpolitik produces small but significant cracks in the ice. West Germany and East Germany begin signing treaties acknowledging each other's existence, even exchanging permanent representatives that function like ambassadors without the title. Suddenly the border crossings, though still heavily guarded, become just a fraction more manageable. Elderly parents from the East can apply to visit their children in the West for Christmas. Western pensioners can make day trips into East Berlin. The paperwork is endless, the Stasi scrutiny relentless, but still grandmothers hug grandchildren who only knew them as faces in faded photographs, and tears blur the sight of watchtowers for a brief moment. Daily life adjusts to this cautious thaw. If you live in West Berlin, you may travel to the East on a day visa, exchanging your Deutsche Marks for near-worthless East German currency at the official rate, though you know you'll never get to spend it all before you're ushered back out. If you live in East Berlin, you may glimpse relatives from the West bearing gifts, chocolate, instant coffee, magazines that sparkle like artifacts from another universe. The gifts are consumed quickly, the conversations guarded, but for a few hours the wall seems less like a prison and more like an ugly, bureaucratic inconvenience. A quirky cultural tidbit of this era, East Germany develops its own brand of rock music, carefully monitored but tolerated because the regime realizes outright bands might spark rebellion. Bands like the Pudis become wildly popular, belting out songs that sound suspiciously Western, yet carry just enough socialist-approved lyrics to slip through censorship. Teenagers in Leipzig or Dresden scream for their idols with the same fervor as those in Liverpool or New York, though under the watchful eye of plainclothes Stasi officers scribbling notes in the audience. Even rebellion has to file paperwork here. And still the suspicion lingers. For every treaty signed, for every cautious handshake across the divide, there is a file folder expanding quietly in a Stasi cabinet, cataloguing who talked to whom, what was said, whether someone laughed too loudly at a Western joke. The government insists that Ostpolitik is a Trojan horse, an attempt to undermine socialism from within. The West insists it is pragmatism, realism, the only way forward. Ordinary Germans sigh and continue queuing for groceries, grateful at least that the mail arrives a little faster and the border seems a little less final. The global stage reinforces the moment. The United States and the Soviet Union, wary of nuclear annihilation, sign arms control agreements. Leaders shake hands, exchange smiles that don't reach their eyes, and nod solemnly for cameras. In that climate, Germany's careful bridge building feels both daring and logical. Yet deep down, you sense how fragile it all is, how easily one misstep could plunge both sides back into icy hostility. One mainstream historical fact underlines the complexity. In 1973, both East and West Germany joined the United Nations, seated side by side, their flags fluttering together in front of the same building. For the first time, the international community acknowledges them as two separate but legitimate states. It feels like recognition but also resignation. The division has become official, the wall less a temporary scar and more a permanent border. As you stroll through Berlin in the 1970s, the city feels like a paradox. Concrete walls and barbed wire still stand, yet there are also new bridges, literal and metaphorical. The clank of checkpoints remains, but so does the laughter of families reunited for a single day. The tension of the Cold War lingers, but it now hums with quieter undertones of negotiation. And you, walking along Unter den Linden or Kurfürstendamm, sense both the hope and the absurdity of it all. East and West remain locked in their opposing systems, each proclaiming superiority, each suspicious of the other. Yet between them, across the guarded checkpoints and endless paperwork, trickles something stubborn, almost human, connection. Even in the shadow of walls, people still reach for one another. And in that reaching, you sense the first tremors of a future neither side fully expects. By the early 1980s, the cautious optimism of Détente has curdled into fatigue. You can almost feel it in the air of East Berlin, a heaviness that hangs not only from the smog of brown coal, but from the weight of an economy that simply won't keep pace with its Western cousin. Shops remain sparse, their shelves lined with jars of pickles and endless canned goods, but missing the small luxuries that glitter in West Berlin shop windows. You stand in a queue that snakes around the block, only to find that the delivery of oranges has already run out. Someone mutters, half-joking, that East Germany's national bird isn't the eagle, but the crane, because construction cranes hover endlessly above projects that never quite seem finished. The joke earns quiet chuckles, but you notice how quickly the laughter dies. The stagnation is undeniable. While West Germany thrives as one of the world's most prosperous economies, East Germany is trapped in a system of central planning that prizes heavy industry over consumer comfort. Tractors and machinery are churned out in bulk, but try to buy a car, a Trabant, the GDR's most famous model, and you may wait 10 or even 15 years after applying. The Trabi becomes both a punchline and a symbol of socialist perseverance, a boxy little vehicle with a two-stroke engine that sputters like a lawnmower, yet beloved by families who pile in for vacations to the Baltic Sea. A quirky tidbit, some Trabis were made with body panels from pressed cotton and resin rather than steel, meaning you could practically dent one with your fist. Still, for many East Germans, that car was a ticket to modest freedom, even if it rattled like a tin can every kilometre of the way. Underneath the consumer shortages lies something deeper, an erosion of faith. In church basements, small circles of dissidents gather using prayer meetings as cover for discussions about peace, democracy, and human rights. The Protestant Church becomes a surprising haven of quiet opposition, tolerated by the regime more than other institutions because religion is awkward to suppress completely. Here candles flicker, hymns rise softly, and conversations about freedom take place beneath the gaze of Christ on the cross, a symbol the party cannot fully co-opt. You can sense that East Germany is not alone in this unease. Across the border in Poland, the solidarity movement led by shipyard worker Lech Wałęsa shakes the communist establishment by demanding not just bread, but dignity. Images of Polish workers standing firm against their government ripple through the Eastern Bloc, carried by whispers, radio signals, and clandestine leaflets. If Poles can speak out, many East Germans wonder why not us historians still argue whether solidarity was the decisive spark that emboldened East German dissent, but few deny its influence. It was proof that resistance was possible even against the seemingly unshakable Soviet-backed order. The East German regime under Erich Honecker responds with its usual mixture of stubborn optimism and repression. Honecker boasts that the GDR is the most successful socialist state in the world, even as shortages deepen and debt to Western creditors piles higher. State television broadcasts endless parades of smiling workers and gleaming missiles, while ordinary citizens smirk at the disconnect between screen and street. It is a strange duality. The official narrative insists on triumph, but everyday reality contradicts it at every turn. Meanwhile, West Germany, flush with prosperity, becomes both a beacon and a burden. Families in the East watch Western television, secretly antennas angled toward signals from Hamburg or Frankfurt. American soap operas, West German newscasts, even commercials for consumer products trickle into East German living rooms, tantalizingly illegal, yet impossible to resist. A child might see an ad for Lego and wonder why their toy box is filled with wooden blocks. A teenager might hear Western pop and find the lyrics more truthful than any state newspaper. The wall is high, the checkpoint strict, but information seeps through like water through a cracked dam. Everyday life in the GDR grows more schizophrenic. By day, you chant slogans at school about socialist brotherhood. By night, you listen quietly to Western radio beneath the covers, headphones pressed close so your parents won't hear. You ride your rickety Trabant to a family picnic, and on the way home, you stop at a state-run shop where half the shelves are empty. You know the Stasi files are thickening like phone books, but you also know your friends still manage to whisper jokes. Somehow existence continues in this strange balance of fear, resignation, and small rebellions. The tension rises with every year of the 1980s. The Soviet Union itself, under Brezhnev and later Gorbachev, wavers between rigidity and reform. In East Germany, Honecker resists change, insisting that socialism will endure for 100 more years. But you can almost feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. The whispers grow louder, the shortages more acute, the comparisons to the West increasingly unbearable. A society can endure hardship, but not when it knows its neighbors are feasting while it scrapes for crumbs. One mainstream historical fact anchors the unrest. By the mid-1980s, nearly every East German citizen had some kind of Stasi file. Informants numbered in the hundreds of thousands, creating one of the most pervasive surveillance states in history. Yet for all its meticulous spying, the system failed to extinguish dissent. Instead, the very weight of its control fueled the hunger for freedom. You walk again through Leipzig in 1988, where small groups begin holding peace prayers in the Nikolaikirche. The gatherings seem harmless, even quaint, but they carry the seeds of something larger. The prayers are about peace, yes, but the unspoken prayer beneath them is for change, for a life without shortages and lies, for a future without walls. And so as the 1980s roll toward their close, you can sense that East Germany is like a pressure cooker rattling on a stove. The lid still holds the guards, still patrol, the slogans still echo, but the steam is building and no system, however airtight, can contain it forever. It begins with candles. Small flickering lights held by quiet hands in the streets of Leipzig in the autumn of 1989. You join the crowd, thousands strong, shuffling through the cobblestone streets around the Nikolaikirche, where those so-called peace prayers have spilled into demonstrations. The air is cool, the chants are soft but insistent. Wir sind das Volk, we are the people. No slogans about socialism, no calls for revolution, just an assertion that the government no longer owns the definition of what it means to be German. The sound is subdued, but you feel how dangerous it is. In a state that jails dissidents for stray words to march openly is itself a radical act. The state's response at first is predictable surveillance intimidation, a heavy police presence. Riot squads appear, helmets gleaming under street lamps. Soldiers stand ready, rifles slung across their chests. But then something unexpected happens. They do nothing. Orders to crush the demonstrations never come, or perhaps they are disobeyed. Historians still argue whether this restraint was deliberate policy or sheer confusion within the regime, but for the marchers, it is liberation. Each Monday, more people join. 10,000, 50,000, then hundreds of thousands, walking with candles, chanting softly into the night. The police lines remain frozen, and suddenly the balance of fear tilts. You sense the mood spreading across the GDR like wildfire. In Dresden, Rostock, Berlin, crowds gather demanding freedom of travel, freedom of speech, free elections. Even East German television, usually a monotone voice of state propaganda, can't entirely hide the unrest. And as you listen to the chants echo through the streets, you realize you're hearing the sound of a wall beginning to crack, not by dynamite or bombs, but by voices. Meanwhile, the world is shifting. In Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev speaks of glasnost openness and perestroika, restructuring reforms that loosen the iron grip of Soviet control. When Gorbachev visits East Berlin in October for the GDR's 40th anniversary, crowds shout his name as though he is their leader instead of Honecker. If you're late with reforms, he warns pointedly, life will punish you. The cameras catch his weary smile. The message is clear. Even the Soviets will no longer prop up their stubborn satellite at any cost. Then comes the moment of confusion that will tumble into history. On November 9, 1989, a clumsy East German official named Günther Schabowski, fumbling through a press conference, announces that new travel regulations are in place and that East Germans can cross the border freely. Journalists ask when the rule begins. Schabowski, rifling through his notes, shrugs. As far as I know, effective immediately. The words broadcast on live television ripple like an earthquake through Berlin. That evening you wander toward the checkpoints, half expecting the guards to slam the gates shut. But instead you find crowds swelling, pressing against the barriers, shouting, demanding passage. Confused border guards make panicked phone calls, receive no clear instructions, and finally, almost reluctantly, open the gates. And then it happens, a flood of people surges into West Berlin, running, laughing, crying, some holding their children high in the air. Strangers embrace, champagne corks fly, and atop the grey slabs of the Berlin Wall, young men and women clamber up and dance, waving flags, beating drums, kissing the stone that once divided them. You climb with them, feeling the rough surface beneath your palms, the dizzying view of searchlights now rendered useless. The West Berliners swarm forward too, clambering up from the other side. Soon the wall, so menacing for decades, is covered not with barbed wire and guards, but with people celebrating graffiti artists, spraying Freiheit across its face. The death strip that once consumed lives now becomes a carnival ground, lit by the flash of cameras and the sound of laughter. The absurdity of it all is striking. Families long separated meet again in the streets, embracing as though waking from a bad dream. West Berlin shops stay open all night, handing out bananas, beer and flowers to stunned East Germans wandering through for the first time. The infamous Trabants sputter across the border, leaving trails of blue smoke, cheered like heroes of the highway. A quirky moment, some Westerners toss bananas into the crowd, leading East Germans to joke bitterly. Later that their first taste of the West was a bruise-inducing fruit. Historians still debate whether the wall's fall was inevitable or accidental. Was it Gorbachev's reforms, the courage of protesters, the weakness of the East German regime, or simply one bureaucratic slip of the tongue at that press conference? The truth, perhaps, is that all of it converged. Pressure had been building for years, and the system collapsed not with a bang, but with a shrug. For you, standing atop the wall that night, it feels less like politics and more like catharsis. The cold concrete that once cast shadows across your life is now just a platform for dancing feet. The fear that once silenced your voice is drowned out by cheers. And as fireworks streak across the sky, you realize you are living through a moment, not just of German history, but of global history, the end of a wall that divided the world itself. And yet as you breathe in the crisp November air, a question lingers quietly beneath the celebrations. The wall is gone, but what comes next? Two Germanys remain with two economies, two governments, two ways of life. Tonight is joy, but tomorrow will demand answers. The wall has crumbled, but unity is not simply a matter of swinging hammers at concrete. You step into 1990 and suddenly Germany finds itself in a whirlwind of diplomacy, negotiation and calculation. The crowds on the streets may be celebrating with beer and Trabants sputtering westward, but behind closed doors, politicians and diplomats are buried in maps, treaties, and the unglamorous business of deciding what a single Germany would actually look like. The shorthand name for it all is the 2+4 talks. Two Germanys, four occupying powers. You imagine the scene. Diplomats from East Germany, West Germany, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain and France sitting around polished tables under ornate chandeliers, coffee cups, steaming translators murmuring into headsets. The questions on the table are monumental. Will a united Germany be allowed to join NATO? Where will its borders lie, especially with Poland, whose history with Germany is scarred by conquest, who pays for the mountain of East Germany's debts? The stakes are dizzying because reunification is not just about two halves of one country, it is about reshaping the balance of Europe. The Americans push hard for a Germany firmly anchored in NATO and the Western Alliance. The British, wary of German power revived, raise their eyebrows in suspicion, while the French, haunted by memories of two world wars, hesitate but eventually concede. The Soviets under Gorbachev are the greatest obstacle after all. A united Germany inside NATO seems to them like moving the Western Alliance right up to Moscow's doorstep. Historians still argue whether Gorbachev yielded because of his idealism, his economic desperation, or sheer inevitability. But in July 1990, he shocks the world by agreeing, yes, Germany may reunify, and yes, it may remain in NATO. It is a geopolitical earthquake delivered in the soft tones of diplomacy. Meanwhile, inside Germany itself, Chancellor Helmut Kohl is racing ahead with his own bold plan. A towering figure with a politician's mix of charm and stubbornness, he seizes the moment with a 10-point plan for reunification that combines economic union, political integration, and above all, speed. Kohl understands that momentum is everything. Hesitation could reopen divisions, so he insists on moving quickly, almost recklessly. West Germany will extend its powerful Deutsche Mark into the east, replacing the near-worthless East German mark. Factories, shops and homes across the GDR will suddenly operate with the hard currency of the West, a move greeted with cheers but also laced with danger. Daily life in East Germany becomes a surreal balancing act. One morning you wake up in Leipzig or Dresden and find that your old currency has vanished, replaced with Deutsche Marks that suddenly make Western goods attainable. Shops that once held only jars of pickles now burst with imported chocolates, electronics and jeans. Families who had hoarded worthless bills trade them in queuing anxiously at banks for a currency that feels like magic. But the shift is a double-edged sword. East German factories, unprepared for the competitive market, begin collapsing under the pressure. Unemployment soars where once the socialist state guaranteed jobs, and the first hints of economic pain creep into the euphoria of political freedom. Still, the sense of inevitability rolls forward. The border with Poland is settled, with unified Germany affirming the Oder-Neisse line as its permanent boundary, quelling fears of revanchist claims. Treaties are drafted, signed, ratified. In living rooms across both Germanies, people watch news anchors explain complicated terms like monetary union and constitutional amendments while still humming the Beatles' Come Together in their heads. The politics may be dry, but the spirit in the streets is electric. A quirky detail captures the absurdity of the moment souvenir hunters begin chipping away at the Berlin Wall with hammers and chisels, selling chunks of concrete graffiti, still clinging to tourists and collectors. You see stalls popping up where yesterday soldiers patrolled, now peddling authentic wall pieces, some genuine, some just concrete rubble scooped from construction sites. The wall, once a symbol of oppression, is now merchandise. Someone even markets bottles of authentic Berlin wall dust, proving once again that capitalism wastes no opportunity. As negotiations near their conclusion, Kohl's political gamble pays off. The East German government, weakened and overwhelmed, essentially dissolves into the structures of the West. Instead of creating a brand new constitution, the Federal Republic's basic law is simply extended eastward, absorbing the GDR's territory. For many East Germans, it feels less like unification and more like annexation, a detail that will spark debates for decades. Historians still argue whether a slower, more equal process might have built a stronger sense of shared identity, or whether Kohl's urgency was the only thing preventing chaos. You walk through Berlin in the summer of 1990 and the city buzzes with contradictions. On Unter den Linden, sleek Mercedes glide past sputtering Trabants. Former East German policemen stand awkwardly in uniforms that no longer hold authority. Young people blast Western pop from boomboxes while their grandparents clutch prayer books and worry about pensions. The graffiti on the wall remains, but already cranes and bulldozers loom, preparing to tear down what is left. It is a city in flux, balancing between past and future suspicion and hope. And then in September 1990, the 2+4 Treaty is signed in Moscow, formally ending Allied rights in Germany and clearing the last obstacle to unity. For the first time since 1945, Germany is sovereign again. The ink is still drying when preparations begin for October 3rd, the official day of reunification. The political work is done. Now the symbolic work celebration must begin. As you leave that year behind, you sense both excitement and unease. The dream of unity, chanted in candlelit marches and danced into existence on the wall, is about to become reality. But reality is always messier than dreams, and tomorrow's Germany will discover just how heavy the burden of unity can be. It is the night of October 2nd, 1990, and you stand in front of the Reichstag building in Berlin, where crowds have gathered in a sea of flags and anticipation. The air is cool, electric, filled with murmurs, cheers, and the faint sound of brass bands warming up. As midnight approaches, the sky suddenly bursts with fireworks crackling and booming above the city that for so long was a synonym for division. The clock ticks over into October 3rd and a new chapter begins. Germany is officially one country again. People cry, people laugh, and strangers embrace as though blood relatives reunited after decades apart. The black, red and gold flag rises above the Reichstag, and for the first time since 1945, it represents a Germany whole and sovereign. You feel the euphoria in your bones. East and West Berliners climb on each other's shoulders, dancing in front of the Brandenburg Gate, where once a wall cast a shadow. Families reunite, not only in spirit, but in reality. Grandparents hug grandchildren, siblings long separated by politics now cling together, whispering endlessly, finally. Politicians deliver speeches about unity, freedom and responsibility. Their words sometimes drowned out by the roar of the crowds. Chancellor Helmut Kohl beams with triumph, his gamble vindicated. The West German anthem becomes the anthem of all, echoing across the square as the last echoes of fireworks fade into the night. And yet beneath the jubilation lies unease. The hard questions begin almost immediately. What will happen to East German workers as their outdated factories collapse in the face of Western competition? How will pensions be secured, debts repaid and identities reconciled? East Germans joke bitterly that they didn't experience reunification, but rather annexation, swallowed whole by the larger, richer West. West Germans, meanwhile, grumble about the solidarity tax introduced to pay for rebuilding the East, questioning whether their sacrifices are being fairly used. The dream of unity is intoxicating, but the morning after always carries a hangover. Daily life shifts quickly. In Dresden or Magdeburg, you might wake up and find your job gone as state-owned industries close. In Leipzig, you might visit a newly opened Western supermarket, marveling at the dizzying variety of yogurt flavors, 20, 30, 40 kinds lined up in gleaming aisles. It feels like paradise and disorientation all at once. In Berlin, cranes rise everywhere, tearing down remnants of the wall, stitching the city back together with steel and glass. For West Berliners, life goes on with an infusion of energy and optimism. For East Berliners, it is a dizzying plunge into a new world where freedom comes hand in hand with uncertainty. Quirky moments reveal the contradictions of reunification. Trabants, once mocked as symbols of socialist stagnation, suddenly become collectibles, their sputtering engines celebrated at car rallies across Germany. Pieces of the wall are sold as souvenirs worldwide, some genuine, some counterfeit, as though freedom itself could be chipped and bottled. Television comedians crack jokes about East Germans' obsession with bananas, while East Germans roll their eyes, tired of being caricatured. Integration is happening not just in parliaments and banks, but in living rooms, jokes and arguments. Historians still argue whether Germany rushed too quickly into unity or whether hesitation would have doomed the process altogether. Some insist Kohl's rapid plans spared the East from chaos. Others believe a slower, more equal merging would have built a stronger sense of shared identity. But one truth is unavoidable. The emotional weight of reunification was immense, and no amount of economic analysis could capture the power of seeing families embrace at border crossings now permanently open. You wander through Berlin in the weeks after reunification, and you notice the contrasts everywhere. Sleek BMWs pass sputtering Trabis. Old socialist slogans fade on factory walls as neon Western advertisements go up. Young East Germans clutch Walkmans and Levi's jeans while their parents mutter about lost security pensions and the predictability of life under socialism. West Germans marvel at the resilience of their Eastern neighbors, yet sometimes treat them with condescension, calling them Ossis while proudly labeling themselves Wesses. A whole vocabulary of division lingers even as the wall is gone. And yet through it all, something deeper binds people together. Football matches draw crowds from both East and West. Schools welcome children who until yesterday studied different histories. The once impenetrable borderlands become hiking trails, families spreading picnic blankets where soldiers once patrolled. You realize that while politics and economics may take decades to settle, ordinary people are already living unity day by day in simple acts of visiting, sharing and laughing. By the end of 1990, Germany has reclaimed not only its borders but also its place in the world. It is no longer a pawn in the Cold War, but a sovereign state shaping Europe's future. Fireworks still echo in memory, and flags still wave in shop windows. Yet when you close your eyes, you remember also the silence of families, divided of soldiers patrolling, of candles flickering in Leipzig. That silence, broken by voices demanding, "We are the people," is what carried Germany to this moment. And so you stand breathing in the air of a unified Berlin, feeling the contradictions, but also the undeniable triumph. A wall fell, a country healed, and a people discovered that unity is not just a political act, but a human one. The story slows now like a long train pulling gently into its final station. The fireworks have dimmed, the crowds have gone home, and Berlin lies quiet beneath a night sky brushed with autumn clouds. You walk past the Brandenburg Gate, once a backdrop of division, now a symbol of wholeness, and you notice how soft the city sounds at rest distant footsteps, a passing tram, the low murmur of voices drifting from a cafe that never would have existed in the days of walls and wire. History often feels loud parades, speeches, gunfire, crowds, but reunification in memory feels tender. It is the warmth of families holding one another after decades apart, the wonder in children's eyes at suddenly open horizons, the relief of breathing air that no longer tastes of checkpoints. There is still unease, of course, economic strains, cultural tensions, questions about fairness and identity. But those questions are part of living, and living, finally, is what both East and West Germans can do together. You linger by the river Spree, watching its waters flow past softly lit bridges. Once that river marked boundaries, guarded and feared. Now it simply flows, carrying reflections of a city, free to gaze at itself whole again. And you, resting here, realize that walls, no matter how tall, how thick, how brutal, are always temporary. Human voices, human hands, human hearts are what last. So let the story end, not with politics or treaties, but with something quieter. A candle still flickering from those Leipzig marches, its flames steady against the night. Small, fragile, but enough to light a path. It is that light you carry with you, a reminder that even in the darkest of divisions, unity waits patiently to return.